Keeler had been suggesting the impossible, and he had denied that anything like what she was suggesting could ever take place. Yet here he was entertaining the possibility that a brother Astartes, someone the War Master valued and trusted, was lying to them for reasons unknown. Loken had tried to find Kirill Sinderman to broach the subject with him, but the Iterator was nowhere to be found, and so Loken had returned to the training halls despondent. The smiling killer, Luke Cedere, was cleaning the dismantled parts of his bolter. The twins, Moy and Ma, were conducting a sword drill, and Loken's oldest friend, Nero Vipers, sat on the benches polishing his breastplate, working out the scars earned on murder. Cedere and Vipers nodded in acknowledgement as he entered. "Garvey," said Vipers. "Something on your mind?" "No." "Why?" "You look a little strung out, that's all." "I'm fine," snapped Loken. Fine, muttered Vipers. "What did I do?" "I'm sorry, Nero," Loken said. I know, Garvey. The whole company's the same. They can't wait to get in theatre and be the first to get to grips with that bastard Temba. Luke's already bet me he'll be the one to take his head." Loken nodded non-committally and said, "Have either of you seen First Captain Abaddon?" "No, not since we got back," replied Cedere, without looking up from his work. "That Remembrancer, the black girl, she was looking for you, though." "Ollerton?" "Aye, that's her. Said she'd come back in an hour or so." "Thank you, Luke," said Loken, turning back to Vipers. "And again, I'm sorry I snapped at you, Nero." "Don't worry," laughed Vipers. "I'm a big boy now, and my skin's thick enough to withstand your bad moods." Loken smiled at his friend and opened his arming cage, stripping off his armor and carefully peeling away the thick mimetic polymers of his subsuit body glove until he was naked but for a pair of fatigues. He lifted his sword and stepped towards the training cage, activating the weapon as the iron-grey hemispheres lifted aside and the tubular combat servitor descended from the center of the dome's top. "Combat drill Epsilon 9, he said. "Maximum lethality." The combat machine hummed to life, long blade limbs unfolding from its sides in a manner that reminded him of the winged clades of murder. Spikes and whirring edges sprouted from the contraption's body, and Loken swiveled his neck and arms in readiness for the coming fight. He needed a clear head if he was to think through all that had happened, and there was no better way to achieve purity of thought than through combat. The battle machine began a soft countdown, and Loken dropped into a fighting crouch as his thoughts once again turned to the first chaplain of the Word-Bearers. Liar. It had been on the 15th day since leaving Interrex space, and a week before reaching Devon, that Loken finally had the chance to speak with Erebus alone. He awaited the first chaplain of the Word-Bearers in the forward observation deck of the Vengeful Spirit, watching smudges of black light and brilliant darkness slide past the great armored viewing bay. "Captain Loken?" Loken turned, seeing Erebus's open, serious face. His shaved, tattooed skull gleamed in the swirling vortices of colored light shining through the glass of the observation bay, rendering his armor with the patina of an artist's palette. "First Chaplain," replied Loken, bowing low. "Please, my given name is Erebus. I would be honored if you would call me by it. We have no need of such formality here." Loken nodded as Erebus joined him in front of the great, multicolored vista laid out before them. "Beautiful, isn't it?" said Erebus. "I used to think so," nodded Loken. "But in truth, I can't look on it now without dread." "Dread? Why so?" asked Erebus, placing his hand on Loken's shoulder. "The warp is simply the medium through which our ships travel. Did not the Emperor, beloved by all, reveal the ways and means by which we might make use of it?" "Yes, he did," agreed Loken, glancing at the tattooed script on Erebus's skull, though the words were in a language he did not understand. "They are the pronouncements of the Emperor as interpreted in the Book of Lorgar, and rendered in the language of Colchis," said Erebus, answering Loken's unasked question. They are as much a weapon as my bolter and blade. Seeing Loken's incomprehension, Erebus said, On the battlefield I must be a figure of awe and majesty, and by bearing the word of the Emperor upon my very flesh, I cow the Xeno and unbeliever before me. Unbeliever? A poor choice of word, shrugged Erebus dismissively. Perhaps misanthrope would be a better term. But I suspect that you did not ask me here to admire the view, or my scripture. Loken smiled and said, No, you're right. I didn't. I asked to speak to you because I know the word-bearers to be a legion with many scholars among their ranks. You have sought out many worlds that were said to be seats of learning and knowledge and brought them to compliance. True, agreed Erebus slowly. Though we destroyed much of that knowledge as profane in the fires of war. But you are wise in matters esoteric, and I desired your counsel on a matter I thought best spoken of privately. Now I am intrigued, said Erebus. What is on your mind? Loken pointed towards the pulsing spectral light of the warp on the other side of the observation bay's glass. Clouds of many colors and spirals of darkness spun and twisted like blooms of ink in water, constantly churning in a maelstrom of light and shadow. No coherent forms existed in the mysterious other world beyond the ship, which, but for the power of the Geller field, would destroy the War Master's vessel in the blink of an eye. The warp allows us to travel from one side of the galaxy to the other, but we don't really understand it at all, do we? Asked Loken. What do we really know about the things that lurk in its depths? What do we know of chaos? Chaos, repeated Erebus, and Loken detected a moment of hesitation before the word-bearer answered. What do you mean by that term? I'm not sure, admitted Loken. It was something Mithras Tull said to me back on Zenobia. Mithras Tull? I don't know the name. He was one of Jepta Naud's subordinate commanders, explained Loken. I was speaking to him when everything went to hell. What did he say, Captain Loken? Exactly. Loken's eyes narrowed at the first chaplain's tone, and he said, Tull spoke of chaos as though it were a distinct force, a primal presence in the warp. He said that it was the source of the most malevolent corruption imaginable, and that it would outlive us all and dance on our ashes. He used a colorful turn of phrase. That he did. But I believe he was serious, said Loken, gazing out into the depths of the warp. Trust me, Loken. The warp is nothing more than mindless energy churning in constant turmoil. That is all there is to it. Or is there something else that makes you believe his words? Loken thought of the slavering creature that had taken the flesh of Xavier Jubal in the water fane under the mountains of 6319. That had not been mindless warp energy given form. Loken had seen a monstrous, thirsting intelligence lurking within the horrid deformity that Jubal had become. Erebus was staring at him expectantly, and as much as the word-bearer had been welcomed within the ranks of the sons of Horus, Loken wasn't yet ready to share the horror beneath the whisperheads with an outsider. Hurriedly he said, I read of battles between the tribes of men and Old Terra, before the coming of the Emperor, and they were said to use powers that were... Was this in the Chronicles of Ursh? Asked Erebus. Yes. How did you know? I too have read it, and I know of the passages to which you refer. Then you also know that there was talk of dark, primordial gods and invocations to them. Erebus smiled indulgently. Yes, and it is the work of outrageous tale-tellers and incorrigible demagogues to make their farragos as exciting as possible, is it not? The Chronicles of Ursh is not the only text of that nature. Many such books were written before unification, and each writer filled page after page with the most outrageous, blood-soaked terrors in order to outdo his contemporaries, resulting in some works of dubious value. You don't think there's anything to it, then? Not at all, said Erebus. Tull said that the Immaterium, as he called it, was the root of sorcery and magic. Sorcery and magic, laughed Erebus, before locking his gaze with Loken. He lied to you, my friend. He was a fraternizer with Xenos breeds and an abomination in the sight of the Emperor. You know the word of an enemy cannot be trusted. After all, did the Interrex not falsely accuse us of stealing one of the Kinnipbrack swords from the Hall of Devices? Even after the War Master himself vouchsafed that we did not? Loken said nothing, as ingrained bonds of brotherhood warred with the evidence of his own senses. Everything Erebus was saying reinforced his long-held beliefs in the utter falsehood of sorcery, spirits, and demons. Yet he could not ignore what his instincts screamed at him. That Erebus was lying to him, and the threat of chaos was horribly real. Mithras Tull had become an enemy, and Erebus was a brother Astartes, and Loken was astonished to find that he more readily believed the warrior of the Interrex. As you have described it to me, there is no such thing as chaos, promised Erebus. Loken nodded in agreement, but despaired as he realized that no one, not even the Interrex, had said exactly what kind of weapon had been stolen from the Hall of Devices. "Did you hear?" asked Ignace Carcassy, pouring yet another glass of wine. "She's got full access to the War Master. It's disgraceful. Here's us breaking our backs to create art worthy of the name in the hope of catching the eye of someone important enough to matter, and she bloody swans in without so much as a by your leave and gets an audience with the War Master." "I heard she has connections," nodded Wenduin, a petite woman with red hair and an hourglass figure that ship's scuttlebutt had down as a firecracker between the sheets. Carcassy had gravitated towards her as soon as he had realized she was hanging on his every bitter word. He'd forgotten exactly what it was she did, though he vaguely remembered something about compositions of harmonic light and shade, whatever that meant. Honestly, he thought, they'll let anyone be a remembrancer these days. The retreat was, as usual, thick with remembrancers. Poets, dramatists, artists, and composers, which had made for a bohemian atmosphere, while off-duty army officers, naval ratings, and crew were there for the civilians to impress with tales of books published, opening night ovations, and scurrilous backstage hedonistic excess. Without its audience, the retreat revealed itself as an uncomfortably vandalized, smoky bar, filled with people who had nothing better to do. The gamblers had scraped the arched columns bare of gilt to make gambling chips, of which Carcassy now had quite a substantial pile back in his cabin, and the artists had whitewashed whole areas of the walls for their own daubings, most of which were either lewd or farcical. Men and women filled all the available tables, playing hands of mercy, mercy, while some of the more enthusiastic remembrancers planned their next compositions. Carcassy and Wenduin sat in one of the padded booths along the wall, and the low buzz of conversation filled the retreat. "Connections," repeated Wenduin sagely. "That's it exactly," said Carcassy, draining his glass. "I heard the Council of Terror, the Sigillite, too." "Throne, how'd she get them?" asked Wenduin. "The connections, I mean." Carcassy shook his head. "Dunno." "It's not like you don't have connections either. You could find out," Wenduin pointed out, filling his glass once more. "I don't know what you have to be worried about anyway. You have one of the Astartes looking after you. You're a fine one to be casting aspersions." "Hardly," snorted Carcassy, slapping a palm on the table. "I have to show him everything I damn well write. It's censorship, that's what it is." Wenduin shrugged. "Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But you got to go to the War Council, didn't you? A little censorship's worth that, I'll bet." "Maybe," said Carcassy, unwilling to be drawn on the subject of the events on Davin, and his terror at the sight of an enraged First Captain Abaddon coming to tear his head off. In any event, Captain Loken had later found him, trembling and afraid, in the commissariat tent, making inroads into a bottle of distillac. It had been a little ridiculous, really. Loken had ripped a page from the bondsman number 7 and written on it in large, blocky letters before handing it to him. "This is an oath of moment, Ignace," Loken had said. "Do you know what that means?" I think so," he had replied. reading the words Loken had written. "It is an oath that applies to an individual action. It is very specific and very precise," Loken had explained. "It is common for an Astartes to swear such an oath before battle when he vows to achieve a certain objective or uphold a certain ideal. In your case, Ignace, it will be to keep what passed here tonight between us." "I will, sir." "You must swear, Ignace. Place your hand on the book and the oath and swear the words." He had done so, placing a shaking hand atop the page, feeling the heavy texture of the page beneath his sweating palm. "I swear not to tell another living soul what passed between us," he said. Loken had nodded solemnly and said, "Do not take this lightly, Ignace. You have just made an oath with the Astartes, and you must never break it. To do so would be a mistake." He'd nodded and made his way to the first transport off Davin. Carcassy shook his head clear of the memory, any warmth or comfort the wine had given him suddenly, achingly absent.
"Hey," said Wendoin, "are you listening to me? You looked a million miles away there." "Yeah, sorry. What were you saying?" "I was asking if there was any chance you could put in a good word for me to Captain Loken. Maybe you could tell him about my compositions? You know, how good they are."
Compositions? What did that mean? He looked into her eyes and saw a dreadful avarice lurking behind her facade of interest, now seeing her for the self-interested social climber she was. Suddenly, all he wanted to do was get away.
"Well, could you?"
He was saved from thinking of an answer by the arrival of a robed figure at the booth. Carcassy looked up and said,
"Yes? Can I help?"
But his words trailed off as he eventually recognized Euphrates Keeler. The change in her since the last time he had seen her was remarkable. Instead of her usual ensemble of boots and fatigues, she wore the beige robe of a female remembrancer, and her long hair had been cut into a modest fringe. Though more obviously feminine, Carcassy was disappointed to find that the change was not to his liking, preferring her aggressive stylings to the strange sexless quality this attire granted her.
"Euphrates? Is that you?"
She simply nodded and said, "I'm looking for Captain Loken. Have you seen him today?"
"Loken?
No.
Well, yes, but not since Davin. Won't you join us?"
he said, ignoring the viperous glare Wendoin cast in his direction. His hopes of rescue were dashed when Euphrates shook her head and said, "No, thank you. This place isn't really for me."
"Nor me, but here I am," smiled Carcassy. "You sure I can't tempt you to some wine or a round of cards?"
"I'm sure, but thanks anyway. See you around, Ignace, and have a good night," said Keeler with a knowing smile. Carcassy gave her a lopsided grin and watched her as she made her way from booth to booth before leaving the retreat.
"Who was that?"
asked Wendoin, and Carcassy was amused at the professional jealousy he heard in her voice.
"That was a very good friend of mine,"
said Carcassy, enjoying the sound of the words. Wendoin nodded curtly.
"Listen, do you want to go to bed with me or not?"
she asked, all pretense of actual interest in him discarded in favour of blatant ambition. Carcassy laughed.
"I'm a man. Of course I do." "And you'll tell Captain Loken of me?"
"If you're as good as they say you are, you can bet on it," he thought.
"Yes, my dear, of course I will,"
said Carcassy, noticing a folded piece of paper on the edge of the booth. Had it been there before? He couldn't remember. As Wendoin eased herself from the booth, he picked up the paper and unfolded it. At the top was some kind of symbol, a long capital I with a haloed star at its centre. He had no idea what it meant and began to skim the words, thinking it might be some remembrance's discarded scribblings. Such thoughts faded, however, as he read the words written on the paper. "The Emperor of mankind is the light and the way, and all his actions are for the benefit of mankind, which is his people. This Emperor is God, and God is the Emperor. So it is taught in this the—"
"What's that?"
asked Wendoin. Carcassy ignored her, pushing the paper into his pocket and leaving the booth. He looked around the retreat and saw several identical pamphlets on various tables around the room. Now, he was convinced that the paper hadn't been on his table before Euphrates' visit, and he began making his way around the bar, gathering up as many of the dog-eared papers as he could find.
"What are you doing?"
demanded Wendoin, watching him with her arms folded impatiently across her chest.
"Piss off," snarled Carcassy,
heading for the exit.
"Find some other gullible fool to seduce. I don't have time."
If he hadn't been so preoccupied, he might have enjoyed her look of surprise. Some minutes later, Carcassy stood before Euphrates Keeler's billet, deep in the labyrinth of arched companionways and dripping passages that made up the residential deck. He noticed the symbol from the pamphlet etched on the bulkhead beside her billet and hammered his fist on her shutter until at last it opened. The smell of scented candles wafted into the corridor. She smiled, and he knew she had been expecting him.
"Lectitio divinitatis," he said,
holding up the pile of pamphlets he'd gathered from the retreat.
"We need to talk."
"Yes, Ignace, we do," she said, turning and leaving him standing at the threshold. He went inside after her. Horace's personal chambers were surprisingly modest, thought Petronella, simple and functional, with only a few items that might be considered personal. She hadn't expected lavish ostentation, but had thought to see more than could be found in any army soldier's billet. A stack of yellowed oath papers filled a footlocker against one wall, and some well-thumbed books sat on the shelves beside the cot-bed, its length and breadth massive to her, but probably barely sufficient for a being with the inhuman scale of a Primarch. She smiled at the idea of Horace sleeping, wondering what mighty visions of glory and majesty one of the Emperor's sons might dream. The idea of a Primarch sleeping was distinctly humanizing, though it had never crossed her mind that one such as Horace would even need to rest. Petronella had assumed that, as well as never aging, the Primarchs did not tire either. She decided the bed was an affectation, a reminder of his humanity. In deference to her first meeting with Horace, Petronella wore a simple dress of emerald green, its skirts hung with silver and topaz netting, and a scarlet bodice with a scandalous décolletage. She carried her data slate and gold-tipped Nemo quill in a demure reticule of gold cord draped over her shoulder, and her fingers itched to begin their work. She had considered leaving Maggard outside the chambers, but she knew the thought of being denied the chance to stand in the presence of such a sublime warrior as Horace would be galling to him. Being in such close proximity to the Astartes had been a powerful intoxicant to her bodyguard, who she could tell looked up to them as gods. She regarded his pleasure at being amongst such powerful warriors as quietly endearing. She ran her fingertips across the wooden surface of Horace's desk, anxious to begin this first session of documenting him. The desk's proportions were as enlarged as those of his bed, and she smiled as she imagined the many great campaigns he had planned here, and the commands for war signed upon its stained and faded surface. Had he written the order granting her previous audience here? She wondered. She remembered her terror and elation as Babeth was run ragged with half a dozen rapid changes of costume for her. In the end, she had settled for something elegant yet demure, a cream dress with an ivory-panelled bodice that pushed her bosom up, and a webbed necklace of red gold that reached up her neck before curling over her forehead in a dripping cascade of pearls and sapphires. Eschewing the Terran custom of powdering her face, she opted instead for a subtle blend of powdered antimony sulfide to darken the rims of her eyes and a polychromatic lip gloss. Horace had obviously appreciated her sartorial restraint, smiling broadly as she was ushered into his presence. Her breath, had it not already been largely stolen by the constriction of her bodice, would have been snatched away by the glory of the War Master's physical perfection and palpable charisma. His hair was short, and his face open and handsome, with dazzling eyes that fixed her with a stare that told her she was the most important thing to him right now. She felt giddy, like a debutante at her first ball. He wore gleaming battle armor the color of a winter sky, its rims formed of beaten gold, and bas-relief text filling each shoulder guard. Bright against his chest plate was a staring red eye, like a drop of blood on virgin snow, and she felt transfixed by its unflinching gaze. Maggard stood behind her, resplendent in brightly polished gold plate and silver mail. Of course, he carried no weapons, his swords and pistols already surrendered to Horus's bodyguards. "My lord," she began, bowing her head and making an elaborate curtsy, her hand held palm down before him in expectation of a kiss. "So, you are of House Carpenus?" asked Horus. She recovered quickly, disregarding the War Master's breach of etiquette in ignoring her hand and asking her a question before formal introductions had been made.
"I am indeed, my lord."
"Don't call me that," said the War Master.
"Oh, of course. How should I address you?"
"Horus would be a good start," he said, and she looked up to see him smiling broadly. The warriors behind him tried unsuccessfully to hide their amusement, and Petronella realized that Horus was toying with her. She forced herself to return his smile, masking her annoyance at his informality, and said,
"Thank you, I shall."
"So, you want to be my documentarist, do you?" asked Horus.
"If you will permit me to fulfill such a role, yes."
"Why?" Of all the questions she'd anticipated, this simple query was one she hadn't been expecting to be thrown so baldly at her.
"I feel this is my vocation, my lord," she began. "It is my destiny as a scion of House Carpenus to record great things and mighty deeds, and to encapsulate the glory of this war, the heroism, the danger, the violence, and the full fury of battle. I desire to—"
"Have you ever seen such a battle, girl?" asked Horus suddenly.
"Well, no, not as such,"
she said, her cheeks flushing angrily at the term girl. "I thought not," said Horus. "It is only those who have neither fired a shot nor heard the shrieks and groans of the dying who cry aloud for blood, vengeance, and desolation. Is that what you want? Is that your vocation?"
"If that is what war is, then yes," she said, unwilling to be cowed before his boorish behavior. "I want to see it all. See it all and record the glory of Horus for future generations."
"The glory of Horus," repeated the War Master, obviously relishing the phrase. He held her pinned by his gaze and said, "There are many remembrances in my fleet, Miss Vivar. Tell me why I should give you this honor." Flustered by his directness once more, she searched for words, and the War Master chuckled at her awkwardness. Her irritation rose to the surface again, and, before she could stop herself, she said, "Because no one else in this ragtag band of remembrances you've managed to accumulate will do as good a job as I will. I will immortalize you. But if you think you can bully me with your bad manners and high and mighty attitude, then you can go to hell, sir." A thunderous silence descended. Then Horus laughed, the sound hard, and she knew that in one flash of anger she had destroyed her chances of being able to accomplish the task she had appointed herself. "I like you, Petronella Vivar of House Carpenus," he said. "You do." Her mouth fell open, and her heart fluttered in her breast.
"Truly?"
she asked, afraid that the War Master was playing with her again. "Truly," agreed Horus.
"But I thought—"
"Listen, lass. I usually make up my mind about a person within 10 seconds, and I very rarely change it. The minute you walked in, I saw the fighter in you. There is something of the wolf in you, girl, and I like that. Just one thing.
"Yes?"
Not so formal next time," he smirked. "We're a ship of war, not the parlors of Mercia. Now, I fear I must excuse myself, as I have to head planetside to Davin for a council of war." And with that, he had been appointed. It still amazed her that it had been so easy, though it meant most of the formal gowns she had brought now seemed wholly inappropriate, forcing her to dress in unbearably prosaic dresses, more at home in the almshouses of the gyptus spires. The dames of society wouldn't recognize her now. She smiled at the memory as her trailing fingers reached the end of the desk and rested on an ancient tome with a cracked leather binding and faded gilt lettering. She opened the book and idly flipped a couple of pages, stopping at one showing a complex astrological diagram of the orbits of planets and conjunctions, below which was the image of some mythical beast, part man, part horse. "My father gave me that," said a powerful voice behind her. She turned, guiltily snatching her hand back from the book. Horus stood behind her, his massive form clad in battle plate. As ever, he was almost overwhelmingly intimidating, physical and masculine, and the thought of sharing a room with such a powerful specimen of manhood in the absence of a chaperone gave her guilt a delicious edge. "Sorry," she said. "That was impolite of me." Horus waved his hand. "Don't worry," he said. "If there was anything I didn't want you to see, I wouldn't have left it out." Despite his easy reassurance, he gathered up the book and slipped it onto the shelves above his bed. She immediately sensed great tension in him, and though he appeared outwardly calm, her heart raced as she felt his furious anger. It bubbled beneath his skin like the fires of a once-dormant volcano on the verge of unleashing its terrible fury. Before she could say anything in reply, he said, "I'm afraid I can't sit and speak to you today, Miss Viva. Matters have arisen on Davin's moon that require my immediate attention." She tried to cover her disappointment, saying, "No matter. We can reschedule a meeting for when you have more time." He laughed, the sound harsh and, she thought, a little too sad to be convincing. "That may not be for a while," he warned. "I'm not someone who gives up easily," she promised. "I can wait." Horus considered her words for a moment, and then shook his head. "No, that won't be necessary," he said with a smile. "You said you wanted to see war." She nodded enthusiastically, and he said, "Then accompany me to the embarkation deck, and I'll show you how the Astartes prepare for war." 5. Our people. A leader. Spear tip. The bridge of the vengeful spirit bustled with activity, the business of ferrying troops and war machines back from the surface of Davin complete, and plans now drawn for the extermination of Yugen Temba's rebellious forces. Extermination. That was the word they used. Not subjugation, not pacification. Extermination. And the Legion was more than ready to carry out that sentence. Sleek and deadly warships broke anchor with Davin under the watchful gaze of the master of the fleet, Boas Comnenus. Moving such a fleet even a short distance in formation was no small undertaking, but the ship's masters appointed beneath him knew their trade, and the withdrawal from Davin was accomplished with the precision of a surgeon wielding a scalpel. Not all the expedition fleet vacated Davin's orbit, but enough followed the course of the vengeful spirit to ensure that nothing would be able to stand before the Astartes spear tip. The journey was a mercifully short one. Davin's moon, a dirty yellow-brown smudge of reflected light, haloed against the distant red sun. To Boas Comnenus, their destination looked like a terrible, bloated pustule against the heavens. Feverish activity filled the embarkation deck as fitters, deckhands, and mechanicum adepts made last-minute pre-flight checks to the growling stormbirds. Engines flared and strobing arc lights bathed the enormous echoing deck in a pale, washed-out industrial glow. Hatches were slammed shut, arming pins were removed from warheads, and fuel lines were disconnected from rumbling engines. 6 of the monstrous flyers sat hunched at the end of their launch rails, cranes delivering the last of their ordnance payloads, while gunnery servitors calibrated the cannons slung beneath the cockpit. The captains and warriors selected to accompany the War Master's spear tip followed ground crews around the Stormbirds, checking and rechecking their machines. Their lives would soon depend on these aircraft, and no one wanted to wind up dead thanks to something as trivial as mechanical failure. Along with the Mournival, Luke Cedere, Nero Vipers, and Verulam Moy, together with specialized squads from their companies, would travel to Davin's moon to fight once more in the name of the Imperium. Loken was ready. His mind was full of new and disturbing thoughts, but he pushed them to one side in preparation for the coming fight. Doubt and uncertainty clouded the mind, and an Astartes could afford neither. Throne, I'm ready for this, said Torgadden, clearly relishing the prospect of battle. Loken nodded. Something still felt terribly wrong to him. But he too longed for the purity of real combat, the chance to test his warrior skills against a living opponent. Though if their intelligence was correct, all they would be facing was perhaps 10,000 rebellious army soldiers, no match for even a quarter this many Astartes. The War Master, however, had demanded the utter destruction of Temba's forces, and 5 companies of Astartes, a detachment of Varvarus's Byzant Janizars, and a battle group of Titans from the Legio Mortis were to unleash his fiery wrath. Princeps Esau Turnid had pledged the Dies Irae itself. "I've not seen a gathering of might like this since before Ulanor," said Torgadden. "Those rebels on the moon are already as good as dead." Rebels. Who ever thought to hear such a word? Enemies, yes, but rebels? Never. The thought soured his anticipation of battle as they made their way to where Aximand and Abaddon checked the arms inventory of their Stormbird, arguing over which munitions would be best suited to the mission. "I'm telling you, the subsonic shells will be better," said Aximand. "And what if they have armor like those Interrex bastards?" demanded Abaddon. "Then we use mass reactive. Tell him, Loken." Abaddon turned at Loken and Torgadden's approach and nodded curtly. "Aximand's right," Loken said. "Supersonic shells will pass through a man before they have time to flatten and create a killing exit wound. You might fire 3 of these through a target and still not put him down." "Just because the last few fights have been against armored warriors, Ezekiel wants them," said Aximand. "But I keep telling him that this battle will be fought against men no more armored than our own army soldiers." "And let's face it," sniggered Torgadden, "Ezekiel needs all the help he could get putting an enemy down." "I'll bloody well put you down, Tarek," said Abaddon, his grim exterior finally cracking into a smile. The first captain's hair was pulled back in a long scalp lock in preparation for donning his helmet, and Loken could see that he too was fiercely anticipating the coming bloodshed. "Doesn't this bother any of you?" asked Loken, unable to contain himself any longer. "What?" asked Aximand. "This," said Loken, waving an arm around the deck at the preparations for war that were being made all around them. "Don't you realize what we're about to do?" "Of course we do, Garvey," bellowed Abaddon. "We're going to kill some damn fool that insulted the War Master." "No," said Loken. "It's more than that. Don't you see? These people we're going to kill, they're not some Xeno empire or a lost strand of humanity that doesn't want to be brought to compliance. They're ours. It's our people we'll be killing." "They're traitors," said Abaddon, needlessly emphasizing the last word. "That's all there is to it. Don't you see? They have turned their back on the War Master and the Emperor, and for that reason their lives are forfeit." "Come on, Garvey," said Torgadden. "You're worrying about nothing." "Am I? What do we do if it happens again?" The other members of the Mournival looked at one another in puzzlement. "If what happens again?" asked Aximand finally. "What if another world rebels in our wake? Then another, and another after that. This is army. But what happens if Astartes rebel? Would we still take the fight to them?" The 3 of them laughed at that, but Torgadden answered. "You have a fine sense of humor, my brother. You know that could never happen. It's unthinkable." "And unseemly," said Aximand, his face solemn. "What you suggest might be considered treason." "What? I could report you to the War Master for this sedition." "Aximand, you know I would never—" Torgadden was the first to crack. "Oh, Garvey, you're too easy," he said, and they all laughed. "Even Aximand can get you now. Throne, you're so straight up and down." Loken forced a smile and said, "You're right. I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry," said Abaddon. "Be ready to kill." The first captain held his hand out in the middle of the group and said, "Kill for the living." "Kill for the dead," said Aximand, placing his hand on top of Abaddon's. "To hell with the living and the dead," said Torgadden, following suit. "Kill for the War Master." Loken felt a great love for his brothers and nodded, placing his hand into the circle. the confraternity of the Mournival filling him with pride and reassurance. "I will kill for the War Master," he promised. The scale of it took her breath away. Her own vessel boasted 3 embarkation decks, but they were poor things compared to this, capable of handling only skiffs, cutters, and shuttles. To see so much martial power on display was humbling. Hundreds of Astartes surrounded them, standing before their allocated stormbirds, monstrous fat-bodied flyers with racks of missiles slung under each wing, and wide rotary cannons seated in forward pintle mounts. Engines screamed as last-minute adjustments were carried out, and each group of Astartes warriors, massive and powerful, began final weapons checks.
"I never dreamt it could be like this,"
said Petronella, watching as the gargantuan blast door at the far end of the launch rails deafeningly rumbled open in preparation for the launch. Through the shimmering integrity field, she could see the leprous glow of Davin's moon against a froth of stars, as blackened jet blast deflectors rose up from the floor on hissing pneumatic pistons. "This," said Horus, "this is nothing. At Ulanor, 600 vessels anchored above the planet of the Greenskin. My entire legion went to war that day, girl. We covered the land with our soldiers. Over 2 million army soldiers, 100 titans of the Mechanicum, and all the slaves we freed from the Greenskin labor camps."
"And all led by the Emperor,"
said Petronella. "Yes," said Horus. "All led by the Emperor."
"Did any other legions fight on Ulanor?"
"Gilliman and the Khan. Their legions helped clear the outer systems with diversionary attacks, but my warriors won the day. The best of the best slogging through blood and dirt. It was I who led the Justaran spear tip to final victory."
"It must have been incredible."
"It was," agreed Horus. "Only Abaddon and I walked away from the fight against the Greenskin warlord. He was a tough bastard, but I illuminated him, and then threw his body from the highest tower."
"This was before the Emperor granted you the title of War Master?"
asked Petronella, her Nemo quill frantically trying to keep up with Horus's rapid delivery. "Yes."
"And you led this, what did you call it, spear tip?"
"Yes, a spear tip. A precision strike to tear out the enemy's throat and leave him leaderless and blind."
"And you'll lead it again here?"
"I will."
"Is that not a little unusual?
"What?"
Someone of such high rank taking to the field of battle."
"I have had the same discussion with the Mournival," said Horus, ignoring her look of confusion at the term. "I am the War Master, and I did not attain such a title by keeping myself away from battle. For men to follow me and obey my orders without question, as the Astartes do, they must see that I am right there with them, sharing the danger. How can any warrior trust me to send him into battle if he feels that all I do is sign orders without appreciating the dangers he must face?"
"Surely there comes a time when considerations of rank must necessarily remove you from the battlefield. If you were to fall—"
"I will not."
"But if you did?"
"I will not," repeated Horus, and she could feel the force of his conviction in every syllable. His eyes, always so bright and full of power, met hers, and she felt the light of her belief in him swell until it illuminated her entire body.
"I believe you,"
she said. "Tell me, would you like to meet the Mournival?"
"The what?"
Horus smiled. "I'll show you."
"Another damned remembrancer,"
sneered Abaddon, shaking his head as he saw Horus and a woman in a green and red dress enter the embarkation deck.
"It's bad enough you've got a gaggle of them hanging around you, Loken, but the War Master? It's disgraceful."
"Why don't you tell him that yourself?" asked Loken.
"I will, don't worry,"
said Abaddon. Aximand and Torgadon said nothing, knowing when to leave the first captain to his collar and when to back off. Loken, however, was still relatively new to regular contact with Abaddon, and his anger with him over his defense of Erebus was still raw. "You don't feel the Remembrancer program has any merit at all?"
"It's a waste of our time to babysit them. Didn't Lehman Russ say something about giving them all a gun?" That sounds a damn sight more sensible to me than having them write stupid poems or paint pictures. It's not about poems and pictures, Ezekiel. It's about capturing the spirit of the age. It's about the history that we are writing.
We're not here to write history, answered Abaddon. We're here to make it.
Exactly. And they will tell it.
Well, what use is that to us?
Perhaps it's not for us, said Loken. Did you ever think of that?
Then who's it for? Demanded Abaddon.
It's for the generations who come after us, said Loken. For the Imperium yet to be. You can't imagine the wealth of information the Remembrances are gathering. Libraries worth of achievements chronicled, galleries worth of artistry, and countless cities raised for the glory of the Imperium. Thousands of years from now, people will look back at these times and they will know us and understand the nobility of what we set out to do. Ours will be an age of enlightenment that men will weep to know they were not a part of it. All that we have achieved will be celebrated, and people will remember the sons of Horus as the founders of a new age of illumination and progress. Think of that, Ezekiel, the next time you dismiss the Remembrances so quickly.
He locked eyes with Abaddon, daring him to contradict him. The first captain met his gaze, then laughed. Maybe I should get one too? Wouldn't want anyone to forget my name in the future, eh? Torgadden clapped both of them on the shoulders and said,
No. Who'd want to know about you, Ezekiel? It's me they'll remember, the hero of Spiderland who saved the Emperor's children from certain death at the hands of the Megarachnids. That's a tale worth telling twice, eh, Garvey?
Loken smiled, glad of Tarek's intervention.
It's a grand tale right enough, Tarek. I wish it was only twice we'd had to hear it,
put in Axiband.
I've lost count of how many times I've heard you tell that tale. It's getting to be as bad as that joke you tell about the bear.
Don't, warned Loken, seeing Torgadden about to launch into a rendition of the joke.
There was this bear, the biggest bear you could imagine,
started Torgadden.
And a hunter.
The others didn't give him a chance to continue, bundling him with shouts and whoops of laughter.
This is the Mournival,
said a powerful voice, and their play-fighting ceased immediately. Loken released Torgadden from a headlock and straightened before the sound of the War Master's voice. The remainder of the Mournival did likewise, guiltily standing to attention before the commander. The dark-complexioned woman with the black hair and fanciful dress stood at his side, and though she was tall for a mortal, she still only just reached the lower edges of his chest plate. She stared at them in confusion, no doubt wondering what she had just seen.
Are your companies ready for battle?
Demanded Horus.
Yes, sir,
they chorused. Horus turned to the woman and said,
This is Petronella Vivar of House Carpenus. She is to be my documentarist, and I, unwisely it seems now, decided it was time for her to meet the Mournival.
The woman took a step towards them and gave an elaborate and uncomfortable-looking curtsy, Horus waiting a little behind her. Loken caught the amused glint concealed behind his brusqueness and said,
Well, are you going to introduce us, sir? She can't very well chronicle you without us, can she? No, Garviel,
smiled Horus.
I wouldn't want the chronicles of Horus to exclude you, would I? Very well. This insolent young pup is Garviel Loken, recently elevated to the lofty position of the Mournival. Next to him is Tarek Torgadden, a man who tries to turn everything into a joke, but mostly fails. Aximand is next. Little Horus, we call him, since he is lucky enough to share some of my most handsome features. And finally we come to Ezekiel Abaddon, captain of my first company.
The same Abaddon from the tower at Ulanor? Asked Petronella, and Abaddon beamed at her recognition.
Yes, the very same, answered Horus, though you wouldn't think it to look at him now.
And this is the Mournival?
They are. And for all their damned horseplay, they are invaluable to me. They are a voice of reason in my ear when all around me is confusion. They are as dear to me as my brother Primarchs, and I value their counsel above all others. In them are the humours of choler, phlegm, melancholia, and sanguinity, mixed in exactly the right amount I need to keep me on the side of the angels.
So they are advisors.
Such a term is too bland for the place they have in my heart. Learn this, Petronella Viva, and your time with me will not have been in vain. Without the Mournival, the office of War Master would be a poor thing indeed.
Horus stepped forward and pulled something from his belt, something with a long strip of parchment drooping from it.
My sons,
said Horus, dropping to one knee and holding the waxen token towards the Mournival.
would you hear my oath of moment?
Stunned by the magnanimity of such an act, none of the Mournival dared move. The other Astartes on the embarkation deck saw what was happening, and a hush spread throughout the chamber. Even the background noise of the deck seemed to diminish at the incredible sight of the War Master kneeling before his chosen sons. Eventually, Loken reached out a trembling gauntlet and took the seal from the War Master's hand. He glanced over at Torgadon and Aximand, either side of him, quite dumbfounded by the War Master's humility. Aximand nodded and said,
We will hear your oath, War Master.
And we will witness it, added Abaddon, unsheathing his sword and holding it out before the War Master. Loken raised the oath paper and read the words the commander had written.
Do you, Horus, accept your role in this? Will you take your vengeance to those who defy you, and turn from the glory of all you have helped create? Do you swear that you shall leave none alive who stand against the future of humanity, and do you pledge to do honor to the 16th Legion?
Horus looked up into Loken's eyes and removed his gauntlet, clenching his bare fist around the blade Abaddon held out.
On this matter, and by this weapon, I swear,
said Horus, dragging his hand along the sword blade and opening the flesh of his palm. Loken nodded and handed the wax seal to the War Master as he rose to his feet. Blood welled briefly from the cut, and Horus dipped the oath paper in the clotting red fluid before affixing the oath paper to his breastplate and grinning broadly at them all. Loken felt his admiration for the War Master fill his heart. All the hurt at their exclusion from his deliberations on the way here forgotten as he held each of them close. How could they ever have doubted him?
Now, we have a war to wage, my sons,
shouted Horus.
What say you? Lupercal!
Yelled Loken, punching the air. The others joined in, and the chant spread until the embarkation deck reverberated with the deafening roars of the sons of Horus.
Lupercal! 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 Lupercal!
The Stormbirds launched in sequence, the War Master's bird streaking from its launch rails like a predator unleashed. At intervals of 7 seconds, each Stormbird fired until all 6 were launched. The pilots kept them close to the vengeful spirit, waiting for the remaining assault craft to launch from the other embarkation decks. So far, there had been no sign of the Glory of Terror, Jugend Tember's flagship, or any of the other vessels left behind, but no one was taking any chances that there might be wolf-pack squadrons of cruisers or fighters lurking nearby. Presently, another 12 Stormbirds of the Sons of Horus took up position with the War Master's squadron, as well as 2 belonging to the Word-Bearers. The formation complete, the Astartes' craft banked sharply, altering course to take them to the surface of Davin's moon. The mighty cliff-like flanks of the War Master's flagship receded, and, like swarms of bright insects, hundreds of army dropships detached from their bulk transporters, each one carrying 100 armed men. But greatest of all were the lander vessels of the Mechanicum. Vast, monolithic structures as big as city blocks, they resembled snub-nosed tubes fitted with a wealth of heat-resistant technologies and recessed deceleration burners. Inertial dampening fields held their cargo secure, and explosive bolts on internal anti-motion scaffolding were primed to release on impact. In the wake of the militant arm of the launch came the logistics of an invasion. Ammunition carriers, food and water tankers, fuel haulers, and a myriad other support vessels essential for the maintenance of offensive operations. Such was the proliferation of craft heading for the surface that no one could keep track of them all, not even the bridge crew under Boas Comnenus, and thus the gold-skinned landing skiff that launched from the civilian bay of the Vengeful Spirit went unnoticed. The invasion fleet mustered in low orbit, orbital winds clutching at streamers of atmospheric gases and spinning them in lazy coils beneath the vessels. As always, it was the Astartes who led the invasion. The way in was rough. Atmospheric disturbances and storms racked the skies, and the Astartes stormbirds were tossed like leaves in a hurricane. Loken felt the craft vibrate wildly around him, grateful for the restraint harness that held him fast to his cage seat. His bolter was stowed above him, and there was nothing to do but wait until the stormbird touched down and the attack began. He slowed his breathing and cleared his mind of all distractions, feeling a hot energy suffuse his limbs as his armor prepared his metabolism for imminent battle. The warriors of Nero Vipus's Locusta squad and Breakspur squad surrounded him, immobile, yet representing the peak of humanity's martial prowess. He loved them all dearly and knew that they wouldn't let him down. Their conduct on Murder and Zenobia had been exemplary, and many of the newly elevated novitiates had been blooded on those desperate battlefields. His company was battle-tested and sure. "Garviel," said Vipus over the inter-armor link, "there's something you should hear."
What is it?
Asked Loken, detecting a note of warning in his friend's voice. "Switch to channel 7, said Vipus. "I've isolated it from the men, but I think you ought to hear this." Loken switched internal channels, hearing nothing but a wash of grainy static, warbling and constant. Pops and crackles punctuated the hiss, but he could hear nothing else.
I don't hear anything.
"Wait. You will," promised Vipus. Loken concentrated, listening for whatever Nero was hearing. And then he heard it. Faint, as though coming from somewhere impossibly far away, was a voice. A gargling, wet voice.
"The ways of man, folly, seek doom of all things. In death and rebirth shall mankind live forever."
Though he was not built to feel fear, Loken was suddenly and horribly reminded of the approach to the Whisperheads, when the air had been thick with the taunting hiss of the thing called Samos.
Oh no,
whispered Loken, as the watery, rasping voice came again.
"Thus do I renounce the ways of the Emperor and his lackey, the War Master, of my own free will. If he dares come here, he will die, and in death shall he live forever. Blessed be the hand of Nurgleth. Blessed be. Blessed be."
Loken hammered his fist against the release bolt on his cage seat and rose to his feet, swaying slightly as he felt a strange nausea cramp his belly. His gen-enhanced body allowed him to compensate for the wild motion of the Stormbird, and he made his way swiftly along the ribbed decking towards the pilot's compartment, determined that they wouldn't walk blind into the same horror as had been waiting for them on 6319. He pulled open the hatch where the flight officers and hard-wired pilots fought to bring them in through the swirling yellow storm clouds. He could hear the same repeating phrase coming over the internal speakers here.
where's it coming from?
He demanded. The nearest flight officer turned and said, "It's a Vox, plain and simple, but... It's coming from a ship, Vox," said the man, pointing at a wavering green waveform on the waterfall display before him. "From the patterning, it's one of ours, and it's a powerful one, a transmitter designed for intership communication between fleets."
It's an actual Vox transmission,
said Loken, relieved it wasn't ghost chatter like the hateful voice of Samos. "Seems to be, but a ship's Vox unit that size shouldn't be anywhere near the surface of a planet. Ships that big don't come this far down into the atmosphere. Leastways, if they want to keep flying, they don't."
Can you jam it?
"We could try, but like I said, it's a powerful signal. It could burn through our jamming pretty quickly."
Can you trace where it's coming from?
The flight officer nodded. Yes, that won't be a problem. A signal that powerful we could have traced from orbit.
Then why didn't you?
It wasn't there before, protested the officer. It only started once we hit the ionosphere. Loken nodded.
Jam it as best you can, and find the source.
He turned back to the crew compartment, unsettled by the uncanny similarities between this development and the approach to the Whisperheads.
Too similar to be accidental,
he thought. He opened a channel to the other members of the Mournival, receiving confirmation that the signal was being heard throughout the spear tip. "It's nothing, Loken," came the voice of the War Master from the Stormbird at the leading edge of the spear tip. "Propaganda." "With respect, sir, that's what we thought in the Whisperheads." "So what are you suggesting, Captain Loken? That we turn around and head back to Davin? Ignore this stain on my honor?"
"No, sir," replied Loken. "Just that we ought to be careful."
"Careful?" laughed Abaddon, his hard chthonic laughter grating even over the Vox. "We are Astartes. Others should be careful around us." "The first captain is right," said Horus. "We will lock onto this signal and destroy it."
"Sir, that might be exactly what our enemies want us to try."
"Then they'll soon realize their error," snapped Horus, shutting off the connection. Moments later, Loken heard the War Master's orders come through the Vox and felt the deck shift under him as the Stormbird smoothly changed course like a pack of hunting birds. He made his way back to his cage seat and strapped himself in, suddenly sure that they were walking into a trap. "What's going on, Garvey?" asked Vipers.
"We're going to destroy that voice," said Loken, repeating the War Master's orders. "It's nothing. Just a Vox transmitter. Propaganda."
"I hope that's all it is."
"So do I," thought Loken.
Soldiers!
The Stormbird touched down with a hard slam, lurching as its skids hit soft ground and fought for purchase. The harness restraints disengaged, and the warriors of Lacasta smoothly rose from their cage seats and turned to retrieve their stowed weaponry as a disembarking ramp dropped from the rear of the Stormbird. Loken led his men from their transport, hot steam and noxious fumes fogging the air as the blue glow of the Stormbird's shrieking engines filled the air with noise. He stepped from the hard metal of the ramp and splashed down onto the boggy surface of Davin's moon. His armored weight sank up to mid-calf, an abominable stench rising from the wet ground underfoot. The Astartes of Lacasta and Breakspur dispersed from the Stormbird with expected efficiency, spreading out to form a perimeter and link up with the other squads from the Sons of Horus. The noise of the Stormbirds diminished as their engines spooled down and the blue glow faded from beneath their wings. The billowing clouds of vapor they threw up began to disperse, and Loken had his first view of Davin's moon. Desolate moors stretched out as far as the eye could see, which wasn't far thanks to the rolling banks of yellow mist clinging to the ground and moist fog that restricted visibility to less than a few 100 meters. The Sons of Horus were forming up around the magnificent figure of the War Master, ready to move out, and spots of light in the yellow sky announced the imminent arrival of the army dropships.
"Nero, get some men forward to scout the edges of the mist," Loken ordered. "I don't want anything coming at us without prior warning."
Vipers nodded and set about establishing scouting parties as Loken opened a channel to Verulam Moy. The captain of the 19th Company had volunteered some of his heavy weapon squads, and Loken knew he could rely on their steady aim and cool heads.
"Verulam, make sure your devastators are ready and have good fields of fire. They won't get much of a warning through this fog." "Indeed, Captain Loken,"
replied Moy.
"They are deploying as we speak." "Good work, Verulam,"
he said, shutting off the Vox and studying the landscape in more detail. Wretched bogs and dank fens rendered the landscape a uniform brown and sludgy green, with the occasional blackened and withered tree silhouetted against the sky. Clouds of buzzing insects hovered in thick swarms over the black waters. Loken tasted the atmosphere via his armor's external senses, gagging on the rank smell of excrement and rotten meat. The senses in his armor's helmet quickly filtered them out, but the breath he'd taken told him that the atmosphere was polluted with the residue of decaying matter, as though the ground beneath him was slowly rotting away. He took a few ungainly steps through the swampy ground, each step sending up a bubbling ripple of burps and puffs of noxious gases. As the noise of the storm birds faded, the silence of the moon became apparent. The only sounds were the splashing of the Astartes through the swampy bogs and the insistent buzz of the insects. Torgadden splashed towards him, his armor stained with mud and slime from the swamps, and even though his helmet obscured his features, Loken could feel his friend's annoyance at this dismal location.
This place reeks worse than the latrines of Ulanor,
he said. Loken had to agree with him. The few breaths he'd taken before his armor had isolated him from the atmosphere still lingered in the back of his throat.
What happened here?
Wondered Loken.
The briefing text didn't say anything about the moon being like this. What did they say? Didn't you read them?
Torgadden shrugged.
I figured I'd see what kind of place it was once we landed.
Loken shook his head, saying,
You'll never make an ultramarine, Tarek. No danger of that,
replied Torgadden.
I prefer to form plans as I go, and Gilliman's lot are even more starch-arsed than you. But leaving my cavalier attitude to mission briefings aside, what's this place supposed to look like then? It's supposed to be climatologically similar to Davin, hot and dry. Where we are now should be covered in forests. So what happened?
Something bad, said Loken, staring out into the foggy depths of the moon's marshy landscape. Something very bad.
Part 2. Plague Moon.
Six. Land of decay. Dead things. Glory of terror. The Astartes spread out through the fog, moving as swiftly as the boggy conditions allowed, and following the source of the Vox signal. Horus led from the front, a living god marching tall through the stinking quagmires and rank swamps of Davin's moon, untroubled by the noxious atmosphere. He disdained the wearing of a helmet, his superhuman physique easily able to withstand the airborne poisons. 4 blocks of Astartes marched, phalanx-like, into the mists, with each member of the Mournival leading nearly 200 warriors. Behind them came the soldiers of the Imperial army, company after company of red-jacketed warriors with gleaming lasguns and silver-tipped lances. Each man was equipped with rebreather apparatus after it was discovered that their mortal constitutions were unable to withstand the moon's toxic atmosphere. Initial landings of armor proved to be disastrous, as tanks sank into the marshland and dropships found themselves caught in the sucking mud. Though the greatest of all the engines of war were those that emerged from the Mechanicum landers, even the Astartes had paused in their advance to watch the descent of the 3 monstrously huge craft, slowly dropping through the yellow skies in defiance of gravity like great primeval monoliths. The blackened hulks travelled on smoking pillars of fire as their colossal retros fought to slow them down. Even with such fiery deceleration, the ground shook with the hammer blow of their impacts. Geysers of murky water thrown hundreds of meters into the air, along with blinding clouds as the swamps flashed to steam. Massive hatches blew open, and the motion-resistant scaffolding fell away as the titans of the Legio Mortis stepped from their landing craft and onto the moon's surface. The Dies Irae led the Death's Head and Zesta's sword. Warlord titans with long, fluttering honor rolls hung from their armored thorax. Each thunderous footstep of the mighty titans sent shockwaves through the swamps for kilometers in all directions, their bastion legs sinking several meters through the marshy ground to the bedrock beneath. Their steps churned huge gouts of mud and water, their appearance that of awesome gods of war come to smite the War Master's enemies beneath their mighty tread. Loken watched the arrival of the Titans with a mixture of awe and unease. Awe for the majesty of their colossal appearance, unease for the fact that the War Master felt it necessary to deploy such powerful engines of destruction. The advance was slow going, trudging through clinging mud and stinking brackish water, all the while unable to see much more than a few dozen meters. The thick fog banks deadened sound in such a way that something close by might be inaudible, while Loken could clearly hear the splash of warriors from Luke Cedere's men far to his right. Of course, he couldn't see them through the yellow mist, so each company kept in regular Vox contact to try and ensure they weren't separating. Loken wasn't sure it was helping, though. Strange groans and hisses, like the expelled breath of a corpse, bubbled from the ground, and blurred shadow forms moved in the mist. Each time he raised his bolter to take aim in readiness, the mist would part, and an armoured figure in the green of the Sons of Horus or the steel grey of the Word-bearers would be revealed. Erebus had led his warriors to Davin's Moon in support of the War Master, and Horus had welcomed their presence. The mist gathered in thickness with unsettling speed, slowly swallowing them up until all Loken could see were warriors from his own company. They passed through a dark forest of leafless dead trees, the bark glistening and wet-looking. Loken paused to examine one, pressing his gauntlet against the tree's surface and grimacing as its bark sloughed off in wet chunks. Writhing maggots and burrowing creatures curled and wriggled within the rotten sapwood.
These trees,
he said. What about them? Asked Vipers.
I thought they were dead, but they're not.
No?
They're diseased, rotten with it.
Vipers shrugged and carried onwards, and once again Loken was struck by the certainty that something terrible had happened here. And looking at the diseased heartwood of the tree, he wasn't sure that it was over. He wiped his stained gauntlet on his leg armor and set off after Vipers. The eerily silent march continued through the fog, and, assisted by the servo muscles of their armor, the Astartes quickly began to outpace the soldiers of the Imperial army, who were finding the going much more difficult.
Mornival,
said Loken over the intersuit link.
We need to slow our advance. We're leaving too big a gap between ourselves and the army detachments.
Then they need to pick up the pace, returned Abaddon. We don't have time to wait for lesser men. We're almost at the source of the Vox.
Lesser men,
said Aximand.
Be careful, Ezekiel. You're starting to sound a little like Eidolon now.
Eidolon? That fool would have come down here on his own to gain glory, snarled Abaddon. I'll not be compared to him.
My apologies, Ezekiel. You're obviously nothing like him,
deadpanned Aximand. Loken listened with amusement to his fellow Mournival's bantering, which, together with the quiet of Davin's Moon, began to reassure him that his concerns over their deployment here might be unfounded. He lifted his armored boot from the swamp and took another step forward, this time feeling something crack under his step. Glancing down, he saw something round and greenish-white bob upwards in the water. Even without turning it over, he could see it was a skull. The paleness of bone wreathed in necrotic strands of rotted flesh and muscle. A pair of shoulders rose from the depths behind it, the spinal column exposed beneath a layer of bloated green flesh. Loken's lip curled in disgust as the decomposed corpse rolled onto its back, its sightless eye sockets filled with mud and weeds. Even as he saw the rotted cadaver, more bobbed to the surface, no doubt disturbed from their resting places on the bottom of the swamps by the footfalls of the Titans. He called a halt and opened the link to his fellow commanders once again, as yet more bodies, hundreds now, floated to the surface of the swamp. Grey and lifeless meat still clung to their bones, and the impacts of the Titans' footfalls gave their dead limbs a horrid animation.
This is Loken, he said. I found some bodies.
Are they Temba's men? Asked Horus.
I can't tell, sir, answered Loken. They're too badly decomposed. It's hard to tell. I'm checking now.
He slung his bolter and leaned forwards, gripping the nearest corpse and lifting it from the water. Its bloated, rancid flesh was alive with wriggling motion, burrowing carrion insects and larvae nesting within it. Sure enough, mouldering scraps of a uniform hung from it, and Loken wiped a smear of mud from its shoulder. Barely legible beneath the scum and filth of the swamps, he found a sewn patch bearing the number 63 emblazoned over the outline of a snarling wolf's head.
Yes, 63rd Expedition, confirmed Loken. They're Timbers. But
Loken never finished the sentence, as the bloated body suddenly reached up and fastened its bony fingers around his neck, its eyes filled with lambent green fire. "Loken," said Horus, as the link was suddenly cut off. "Loken?"
Something amiss?
asked Torgadden.
I don't know yet, Tarek,
answered the War Master. Suddenly the hard bangs of bolter fire and the whoosh of flame units could be heard from all around them.
"Second company!"
shouted Torgadden.
"Stand to! Weapons free!"
"Where's it coming from?" bellowed Horus.
"Can't say," replied Torgadden. "The mist's playing merry hell with the acoustics." "Find out,"
ordered the War Master. Torgadden nodded, demanding contact reports from all companies. Garbled shouts of impossible things came over the link, along with the louder bark of heavy bolter fire. Gunfire sounded to his left, and he spun to face it, his bolter raised before him. He could see nothing but the staccato flashes of weapon fire and the occasional blue streak of a plasma shot. Even the external senses of his armor were unable to penetrate the creeping mist.
"Sir, I think we—"
Without warning, the swamp exploded as something vast and bloated erupted from the water before him. Its gangrenous, rotten flesh barreled into him, its bulk sufficient to knock him onto his back and into the swamp. Before he went under the dark water, Torgadden had the fleeting impression of a yawning mouth filled with hundreds of fangs and a glaucous cyclopean eye beneath a horn of yellowed bone. "I don't know. The command net just went crazy," said Moderati Primus Arucan in response to Princeps Turnit's question. The external surveyors had suddenly and shockingly filled with returns that hadn't been there a second ago, and his Princeps had demanded to know what was going on.
"We'll find out, damn you," ordered Turnip. "The War Master's out there."
"Main guns spooled up and ready to fire," reported Moderati Primus Titus Cassar.
"We need a damn target first. I'm not about to fire into that mess without knowing what I'm shooting at," said Turnit. "If it was army, I'd risk it, but not Astartes."
The bridge of the Dies Irae was bathed in a red light, its 3 command officers seated upon their control seats on a raised dais before the green glow of the tactical plot. Wired into the very essence of the Titan, they could feel its every motion as though it were their own. Despite the mighty war machine beneath him, Jonah Arucan suddenly felt powerless as this unknown enemy arose to engulf the sons of Horus. Expecting armored opposition and an enemy they could see, they had been little more than a focus for the Imperial forces to rally around so far. For all the Titan's overwhelming superiority in firepower, there was little they could do to aid their fellows.
"Getting something," reported Cassar. "Incoming signal."
"What is it? I need better information than that, damn you," shouted Turnit.
"Aerial contact. Signals firming up. Fast-moving and heading towards us."
"Is it a Stormbird?"
"No, sir. All Stormbirds are accounted for in the deployment zone, and I'm not picking up any military transponder signals."
Turnit nodded.
"Then it's hostile. Do you have a solution, Arucan?"
"Running it now, Princeps."
"Range 600 meters and closing," said Cassar. "God Emperor protect us. It's coming right for us."
"Arucan, that's too damn close. Shoot it down."
"Working on it, sir."
"Work faster."
The dense mists made looking through the frontal windshield pointless. Nevertheless, there was an irresistible fascination in looking out at an alien world. Not that there was much, or indeed anything, to see. Thus, Petronella's first impressions upon breaching the upper atmosphere were of disappointment, having expected exotic vistas of unimaginable alien strangeness. Instead, they had been buffeted by violent storm winds and could see nothing but the yellow skies and banks of fog that seemed to be gathered around another unremarkable patch of brown swampland ahead. Though the War Master had politely but firmly declined her request to travel to the surface with the warriors of the Spear-Tip, she had been sure there was a glint of mischief in his eye. Taking that for a sign of tacit approval, she had immediately gathered Maggard and her flight crew in the shuttle bay in preparation for descent to the moon below. Her gold-skinned landing skiff launched in the wake of the army dropships, losing itself in the mass of assault craft, heading to the moon's surface. Unable to keep pace with the invasion force, they had been forced to follow the emission trails and now found themselves circling deep in a soup of impenetrable fog that rendered the ground below virtually invisible. "Getting some returns from up ahead, my lady," said the first officer. "I think it's the spear tip." "At last," she said. "Get as close as you can, then set us down. I want to get out of this mist so I can see something worth writing about." "Yes, ma'am." Petronella settled back into her seat as the skiff angled its course towards the source of the surveyor return, irritably altering the position of her restraint harness to try to avoid creasing the folds of her dress. She gave up, deciding that the dress was beyond saving, and returned her gaze to the windshield as the pilot gave a sudden yell of terror. Hot fear seethed in her veins as the mist before them cleared, and she saw a huge mechanical giant before them, its proportions massive and armoured. Saw-toothed bastions and towers filled her vision, massive cannons and a terrible snarling face of dark iron. "Thrown!" cried the pilot, hauling on the controls in a desperate evasive manoeuvre as roaring fire and light horrifyingly filled the windshield. Petronella's world exploded in pain and broken glass as the guns of the Des Irae opened fire and blasted her skiff from the yellow skies. Loken surged backwards in horror and disgust as the cadaver attempted to strangle the life from him with its slimy fingers. For something as apparently fragile as a rotted corpse, the thing was possessed of a fearsome strength, and he was dragged to his knees by the weight and power of the creature. With a thought, he flooded his metabolism with battle stims, and fresh strength surged into his limbs. He gripped the arms of his attacker and pulled them from its reeking torso in a flood of dead fluids and a wash of brackish blood. The fire died in the thing's eyes, and it flopped lifeless to the swamp. He pushed himself to his feet and took stock of the situation, his Astartes training suppressing any notion of panic or disorientation. From all around them, the bodies he had previously thought to be lifeless were rising from the dark waters and launching themselves at his warriors. Bolters blasted chunks of moulded flesh from their bodies or tore limbs from putrefied torsos, but still they kept coming, tearing at the Astartes with diseased yellowed claws. More of the things were rising all around them, and Loken brought 3 of them down with as many shots, shattering skulls and exploding chests with mass reactive shells. "Sons of Horus, on me!" he yelled. "Form on me!" The warriors of 10th Company calmly began falling back to their captain, firing as they went at the necrotic horrors rising from the swamp like creatures from their worst nightmares. Hundreds of dead things surrounded them, mouldering corpses and bloated, muttering abominations, each with a single milky, distended eye and a scabrous horn sprouting from its forehead. What were they? Monstrous xeno creatures with the power to reanimate dead flesh, or something far worse? Thick, buzzing clouds of flies flew round them, and Loken saw an Astartes go down, the feeds on his helmet thick with fat-bodied insects. The warrior frenziedly tore his helmet off, and Loken was horrified to see his flesh rotting away with an unnatural rapidity, his skin greying and peeling away to reveal the liquefying tissue beneath. The bark of bolter fire focused him, and he returned his attention to the battle before him, emptying magazine after magazine into the shambling mass of repulsive creatures before him. "Headshots only!" he cried, as he put another of the dead things down, its skull a ruin of blackened bone and sloshing ooze. The tide of the battle began to turn as more and more of the shambling horrors went down and stayed down. The green-fleshed things with grotesquely distended bellies took more killing, though it seemed to Loken that they dissolved into stinking matter as they fell into the water of the swamp. More shapes moved through the mist as a thunderous roar of heavy cannon fire came from behind them, followed by the bright flare of an explosion high above. Loken looked up to see a golden landing skiff trailing smoke and fire wobble in the sky, though he had not the time to wonder what a civilian craft was doing in a war zone as yet more of the dead things climbed from the water. Too close for bolters, he drew his sword and brought the monstrously toothed blade to life with a press of the activation stud. A ghastly thing of decomposed flesh and rotten meat hurled itself at him, and he swung his blade two-handed for its skull. The blade roared as it slew. gobbets of wet grey meat spattering his armor as he ripped the sword through from brain pan to groin. He swung at another creature, the green fire of its eyes flickering out as he hacked it in two. All about him, sons of Horus went toe to toe with the terrible creatures that had once been members of the 63rd expedition. Rotted hands clamped onto his armor from beneath the water, and Loken felt himself being dragged down. He roared and reversed his grip on his sword, stabbing it straight down into leering skulls and rotted faces. But incredibly, their strength was the greater, and he could not resist their pull. "Garvey!" shouted Vipers, hacking enemies from his path as he forged through the swamp towards him. "Luke, help me!" cried Vipers, grabbing onto Loken's outstretched arm. Loken gripped onto his friend's hand as he felt another set of hands grip him around the chest and haul backwards. "Let go, you bastards!" roared Luke Cederay, hauling with all his might. Loken felt himself rising and kicked out as the swamp creatures finally released him. He scrambled back and clambered to his feet. Together, he, Luke, and Nero fought with bludgeoning ferocity, although there was no shape to the battle now, if there ever had been. It was nothing more than butcher work, requiring no swordsmanship or finesse, just brute strength and a determination not to fall. Bizarrely, Loken thought of Lucius, the swordsman of the Emperor's Children Legion, and of how he would have hated this inelegant form of war. Loken returned his attention to the battle, and with Luke Cederay and Nero Vipers in the fight, he was able to gain some space and time to reorganize. "Thanks, Luke. Nero, I owe you," he said in a lull in the fighting. The sons of Horus reloaded bolters and cleaned chunks of dead flesh from their swords. Sporadic bursts of gunfire still sounded from the swamp, and strobing flashes lit the fog with firefly bursts. Off to their left, Loken saw a burning pyre where the skiff had come down, its flames acting as a beacon in the midst of the obscuring fog. "No problem, Garvey," said Cederay, and Loken knew that he was grinning beneath his helmet. "You'll do the same for me before we're out of this shitstorm, I'll wager." "You're probably right, but let's hope not." "What's the plan, Garvey?" asked Vipers. Loken held up his hand for silence as he attempted to make contact with his Mournival brothers and the War Master once more. Static and desperate cries filled the Vox, terrified voices of army soldiers and the damned, gurgling voices that kept saying, "Blessed be Nergleth," over and over. Then a voice cut across every channel, and Loken almost cried aloud in relief to hear it. "All sons of Horus, this is the War Master. Converge on this signal. Head for the flames." At the sound of the War Master's voice, fresh energy filled the tired limbs and hearts of the Astartes, and they moved off in good order towards the burning pillar of fire coming from the wrecked skiff they had seen earlier. Loken killed with a methodical precision, each shot felling an opponent. He began to feel that they finally had the measure of this grotesque enemy. Whatever fell energy bestowed animation upon these diseased nightmares was clearly incapable of giving them much more than basic motor functions and an unremitting hostility. Loken's armor was covered in deep gouges, and he wished he knew how many men he had lost to the loathsome hunger of the dead things. He vowed that this Nergleth would pay dearly for each of their deaths. She could barely breathe, her chest hiking as she drew in convulsive gulps of air from the respirator Maggard was pushing against her face. Petronella's eyes stung, tears of pain coursing down her cheeks as she tried to push herself into a sitting position. All she remembered was a fury of noise and light, a metallic shriek, and a bone-jarring impact as the skiff crashed and broke into pieces. Blood filled her senses, and she felt excruciating pain all down her left side. Flames leapt around her, and her vision blurred with the sting of the atmosphere and smoke. "What happened?" she managed, her voice muffled through the respirator's mouthpiece. Maggard didn't answer, but then she remembered that he couldn't, and twisted her head around to gain a better appreciation of their current situation. Torn-up bodies clothed in her livery littered the ground, the pilots and flight crew of her skiff, and there was a lot of blood covering the wreckage. Even through the respirator, she could smell the gore. Clawing banks of leprous fog surrounded them, though the heat of the flames appeared to be clearing it in their immediate vicinity. Shambling shapes surrounded them, and relief flooded her as she realized that they would soon be rescued. Maggard spun, drawing his sword and pistol, and Petronella tried to shout at him that he must stand down, that these were their rescuers. Then the first shape emerged from the smoke, and she screamed as she saw its diseased flesh and the rotted innards hanging from its opened belly. Nor was it the worst of the approaching things. A cavalcade of cadavers with bloated, ruptured flesh and putrid, diseased bodies sloshed through the mud and wreckage towards them, clawed hands outstretched. The green fire in their eyes spoke of monstrous appetites, and Petronella felt a gut-wrenching terror greater than anything she had ever known. Only Maggard stood between her and the walking, diseased corpses, and he was but one man. She had watched him train in the gymnasia of Kairos many times, but she had never seen him draw his weapons in anger. Maggard's pistol barked, and each shot blasted one of the shambling horrors from its feet, neat holes drilled in its forehead. He fired and fired until his pistol was empty, and then holstered it and drew a long triangular-bladed dagger. As the horde approached, her bodyguard attacked. He leapt, feet first, at the nearest corpse, and a neck snapped beneath his boot heel. Maggard spun as he landed, his sword decapitating a pair of the monsters, and his dagger ripping the throat from another. His Curlian rapier darted like a silver snake, its glowing edge stabbing and cutting with incredible speed. Whatever it touched dropped instantly to the muddy ground like a servitor with its Dotrina wafer pulled. His body was always in motion, leaping, twisting, and dodging away from the clutching hands of his diseased attackers. There was no pattern to their assault, simply a mindless host of dead things seeking to envelop them. Maggard fought like nothing she had ever seen, his augmetic muscles bulging and flexing as he cut down his foes with quick, lethal strokes. No matter how many he killed, there were always more pressing in, and they steadily forced him back a step at a time. The horde of creatures began to surround them, and Petronella saw that Maggard couldn't possibly hold them all back. He staggered towards her, bleeding from a score of minor wounds. His flesh was blistered and weeping around the cuts, and there was an unhealthy pallor to his skin, despite his respirator gear. She wept bitter tears of horror as the monsters closed in, jaws opening wide to devour her flesh, and grasping hands ready to tear her perfect skin and feast on her innards. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. The Great Crusade wasn't supposed to end in failure and death. A corpse with mouldering, sagging skin lurched past Maggard, his blade lodged in the belly of a giant, necrotic thing with green flesh that was thick with flies. She screamed as it reached for her. Deafening bangs thundered behind her, and the creature disintegrated in an explosion of wet meat and bone. Petronella covered her ears as the thunderous roar of gunfire came again, and her attackers were torn apart in a series of rancid explosions, falling back into the fires of the skiff and burning with stinking green flames. She rolled onto her side, crying in pain and fear as the terrifyingly close volleys continued, clearing a path for the massive, armored warriors of the Sons of Horus. A giant towered above her, reaching for her with his armored gauntlet. He wore no helmet and was silhouetted by a terrible red glow, his awesome bulk haloed by blazing plumes of fire and pillars of black smoke. Even through her tears, the War Master's beauty and physical perfection rendered her speechless. Though blood and dark slime covered his armor, and his cloak was torn and tattered, Horus towered like a war god unleashed, his face a mask of terrifying power. He lifted her to her feet, as easily as one might lift a babe in arms, while his warriors continued the slaughter of the monstrous dead things. More and more Sons of Horus were converging on the crash site, guns firing to drive the enemy back and forming a protective cordon around the War Master. "Miss Viva," demanded Horus, "what in the name of terror are you doing here? I ordered you to stay aboard the Vengeful Spirit." She struggled for words, still in awe of his magnificent presence. He had saved her. The War Master had personally saved her, and she wept to know his touch. I had to come. I had to see.
Your curiosity almost got you killed, raged Horus. If your bodyguard had been less capable, you'd already be dead.
She nodded dumbly, holding on to a twisted spar of metal to keep from collapsing as the War Master stepped through the debris towards Maggard. The gold-armored warrior held himself erect, despite the pain of his wounds. Horus lifted Maggard's sword arm, examining the warrior's blade.
"What's your name, warrior?"
asked the War Master. Maggard, of course, did not answer, looking over at Petronella for help in answering.
"He cannot answer you, my lord," said Petronella.
"Why not? Doesn't he speak Imperial Gothic?"
"He does not speak at all, sir. House Carpinus' chaperones removed his vocal cords."
"Why would they do that?"
"He is an indentured servant of House Carpinus, and it is not a bodyguard's place to speak in the presence of his mistress."
Horus frowned, as though he did not approve of such things, and said,
"Then you, tell me what his name is."
"He is called Maggard, sir."
"And this blade he wields, how is it that the slightest touch of its edge slays one of these creatures?"
"It is a Curlian blade, forged on ancient terror, and said to be able to sever the connection between the soul and the body, though I have never seen it used before today."
"Whatever it is, I think it saved your life, Miss Viva."
She nodded as the War Master turned to face Maggard once more, and made the sign of the Aquila before saying,
"You fought with great courage, Maggard. Be proud of what you did here today."
Maggard nodded and dropped to his knees with his head bowed, tears streaming from his eyes at being so honored by the War Master. Horus bent down and placed the palm of his hand on the bodyguard's shoulder, saying, "Rise, Maggard. You have proven yourself to be a warrior, and no warrior of such courage should kneel before me." Maggard stood, smoothly reversing the grip of his sword and offering it, hilt first, to the War Master. The yellow sky reflected coldly in his golden eyes, and Petronella shivered as she saw a new-found devotion in her bodyguard's posture, an expression of faith and pride that frightened her with its intensity. The meaning of the gesture was clear. It said what Maggard himself could not. "I am yours to command." Thus assembled, the Astartes took stock of their situation. All four phalanxes had rendezvoused around the crash site as the attacks from the diseased and dead things ceased for the time being.